The rain had just stopped in London, leaving the streets slick and reflective under the pale morning light. Outside a quiet, unmarked government building, a cluster of reporters huddled with steaming cups of coffee, their breath fogging in the cool air. They weren't here for a scheduled press conference, nor for a predictable political update. They were here because someone high up, had been leaking whispers of a scandal that threatened to destroy not just reputations, but an entire movement built on hope, honor, and sacrifice. When the glass doors swung open and Dominic Reid OBE stepped out, clutching a worn leather briefcase and a stack of papers secured with a thick elastic band, every camera snapped to life. He didn't look left or right. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace, ignoring the barrage of shouted questions. But then, just as he reached his black sedan, one reporter managed to catch his eye and call out, "Is it true, Mr. Reid? Is the Duchess involved?" Reid paused, his expression tightening. Without answering directly, he simply said, "It's all there. She won't be able to talk her way out of this," before slipping into the car and disappearing into the London traffic. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. That moment would become the spark for a story that spiraled into one of the most explosive royal-adjacent scandals in recent memory. But to understand why Dominic Reid's words carried such weight, you have to understand who he is, the mission he's devoted his life to, and the deep betrayal that made him step into the spotlight against one of the most polarizing women in the world. The Invictus Games, for many, is not just an athletic event. It's a lifeline for veterans who've lost not only limbs, but the sense of purpose that once defined their lives. It's a global platform to celebrate resilience, to show the world that those wounded in service can still achieve greatness. And Dominic Reid, as CEO, has been at its heart since 2014, managing its growth from an ambitious royal project to a respected international institution. When Meghan Markle stepped into the royal circle, she seemed at first to be an ally to this cause. Charismatic, media-savvy, and married to the founder of the Games himself, Prince Harry, she presented herself as a modern advocate for veterans, one who could use her star power to amplify their stories. And for a while, it worked. Cameras captured her smiling with wounded warriors, embracing mothers of injured soldiers, and delivering speeches about honor, recovery, and unity. It was a narrative that seemed perfect until the cracks began to show. Those close to the organization began to notice oddities. Delays in payments to veteran rehabilitation programs, sudden budget cuts to adaptive sports equipment, and the quiet shelving of planned mental health initiatives. On the surface, these issues could have been attributed to standard charity growing pains, but Reid, with decades of management experience, sensed something more. The numbers on the balance sheets didn't align with the public commitments. Transactions appeared in unusual patterns, some routed through third-party entities with no clear link to the Invictus mission. Still, Reid didn't want to believe it. Confronting someone as high-profile as the Duchess of Sussex wasn't just risky, it was potentially career-ending. The royal-adjacent ecosystem is a delicate one, and even the suggestion of impropriety could trigger a storm of legal threats, PR counterattacks, and public smears. But the more he looked, the more undeniable it became. Receipts linked to private jet charters appeared alongside invoices for high-end jewelry. Wardrobe expenses rivaling the budgets of entire veteran support programs. First-class international trips booked under ambiguous, outreach labels, but lacking any documented veteran engagement. By the time whispers began to leak beyond the Invictus offices, the atmosphere was already tense. Staffers exchanged nervous glances when Meghan's name came up in financial meetings. Some veterans quietly began to question why promised services had been delayed without explanation. Reid's private meetings with auditors became more frequent and his sleep more elusive. What he was uncovering wasn't just a breach of protocol. It was, in his view, a betrayal of the very people the charity was built to serve. And then came the moment he knew the situation had crossed the point of no return. One late evening, long after most staff had left, Reid sat in his office with a forensic accountant hired under strict confidentiality. They traced a series of transactions from a donor event in New York. The donations had been earmarked for a veteran's prosthetic upgrade program. Yet within 2 weeks, a significant portion of the funds had been transferred to a private account linked to a shell corporation. From there, records showed payments for luxury accommodations in the Maldives, a high-profile fashion purchase in Paris, and a six-figure deposit to an exclusive jewelry designer in Los Angeles. The shell company's listed representative? A name Reid recognized immediately, one of Meghan's personal staff. It was no longer a matter of suspicion. It was a matter of evidence. But Reid knew that going public, or even alerting the board, would set off a chain reaction he couldn't control. Meghan wasn't just a public figure. She was a master of narrative, someone who had built an entire brand around being the misunderstood outsider, the target of unfair attacks. Any accusation would be met with fierce denials, counterclaims of bias, and possibly legal action aimed at destroying his credibility. In the weeks that followed, he moved carefully, quietly gathering documents, recordings, and testimonies from those willing to speak off the record. Every file he compiled added another brick to the wall of evidence, but also another weight to the burden he carried. This wasn't just about one woman. It was about the veterans whose dignity was being used as currency for personal luxury. Reid felt the anger build with each passing day, the injustice gnawing at him. By the time law enforcement became involved, the machine was already in motion. Confidential briefings were held behind closed doors. Meghan's movements were monitored discreetly. A sealed indictment was prepared while her public schedule continued as if nothing were amiss. The arrest, when it came, would not just shock the public. It would shake the foundations of how celebrity charity work is viewed. But that moment was still in the distance. For now, all anyone knew was that Dominic Reid had walked out of that building, uttered that one line, and set into motion the unraveling of a carefully constructed royal narrative. The question that hangs over everything now is this: why would someone who had the world's sympathy, a platform to make genuine change, and access to unlimited publicity risk it all? Was it greed, arrogance, or something deeper? That's what we're going to explore in the hours ahead. Because this is not just a story about money. It's a story about trust, betrayal, and what happens when the lines between personal ambition and public service are crossed. As the investigation deepened, the layers of deception became harder to ignore. Reid meticulously mapped out the flow of funds, and what emerged was more than just a mismanagement issue. It was a calculated pattern of diversion that spanned continents. Donations that were supposed to support mental health retreats for veterans in the United States appeared in luxury property accounts in Canada. Grants intended for adaptive sports programs in Europe were traced to private accounts in the Caribbean, all while the supposed beneficiaries waited months, sometimes years, for resources that never arrived. Veterans who had once looked up to the Invictus Games as a symbol of resilience and opportunity began to notice gaps. Some quietly shared concerns about delayed reimbursements for travel to competitions. Others spoke of missing adaptive equipment. Reid, while ever diplomatic, could see the human impact of these discrepancies. Each report, each complaint, was a stark reminder that this was not abstract bookkeeping. It was the very livelihoods and morale of wounded soldiers hanging in the balance. He called one veteran personally, a former Marine who had won gold at the previous Invictus Games but had been denied access to new training gear due to budgetary constraints. The man's voice, filled with quiet frustration and disappointment, hit Reid harder than any spreadsheet ever could. "I gave my body for this country," the veteran said, "and now even the people who were supposed to stand with us, they've turned away." It was in moments like that, in the faces of those he had vowed to protect through the integrity of the games, that Reid felt the enormity of the betrayal. Reid's next step was a decision that would define his career. Instead of quietly resigning or reporting the issue internally and risking suppression by powerful figures in the royal and charitable ecosystem, he chose transparency. He knew that once he went public, the story would explode across media outlets, dominate social feeds, and spark debates worldwide. But it was a risk he was willing to take because silence would mean complicity. Weeks before the public revelation, he coordinated with legal experts to ensure the evidence was irrefutable. Each transaction, every invoice, every internal memo was meticulously logged and cross-verified. Private communications, previously dismissed as trivial, were suddenly seen in a new light. text messages arranging luxury flights disguised as outreach efforts, emails authorizing extravagant shopping trips under the guise of networking, even calendar entries that mapped leisure vacations to donor event schedules. The picture was clear. Funds intended for the brave men and women who had risked everything for their country were being funneled into opulence. The challenge, Reid knew, was framing this story so that the public could grasp both its gravity and its personal impact. It wasn't enough to just report numbers. He needed to humanize the consequences. He began compiling accounts from veterans who had been directly affected. Stories of young soldiers forced to train in substandard conditions or wheelchair-bound athletes unable to access appropriate equipment were paired against the backdrop of a narrative that painted a stark contrast between duty and indulgence. Even within the Invictus organization, there were tensions. Staffers wrestled with conflicting loyalties, some fearful of speaking out due to potential backlash from royal representatives or media scrutiny. Others, however, found courage in Reid's steadfast approach, quietly providing corroborating evidence and first-hand accounts. Together, they constructed a comprehensive dossier that left no room for ambiguity. By the time Reid made the decision to step into the public eye, he was armed with enough proof to withstand the inevitable legal challenges and PR counterattacks. The first public hint of the scandal came via an exclusive briefing with select journalists, each carefully vetted. Reid, standing in a modest conference room, laid out the trajectory of diverted funds with calm precision. He didn't dramatize, he didn't editorialize. He simply presented the evidence and let the facts speak. Yet the weight of the revelation was immediately apparent. Reporters exchanged glances, aware that this was not a minor financial discrepancy. It was a seismic revelation that could ripple through the royal family, global charity networks, and public trust alike. Social media erupted almost instantly. Headlines flashed across screens. Invictus Fund's scandal rocks royal charity. Meghan Markle accused of diverting millions from veterans. CEO Dominic Reid exposes luxury spending allegations. Within hours, every news outlet was chasing the story. Analysts dissected the financial documents. Social commentators debated intent versus negligence, and veterans advocacy groups demanded accountability. The narrative that had once centered on hope, resilience, and recovery was now overshadowed by allegations of greed, manipulation, and betrayal. And through it all, Reid remained composed. He knew that the story wasn't just about sensational headlines. It was about restoring integrity to an institution that had become a symbol of strength for those who had sacrificed everything. The scrutiny, the speculation, the media frenzy, all of it was secondary to the core mission, ensuring that veterans received the support they had earned. Every carefully documented transaction, every corroborated testimony, was a step toward reclaiming that mission from the shadows of deception. What happened next would not only change the perception of Meghan Markle in the public eye, but also redefine the expectations placed on celebrity involvement in charitable work. Reid's revelations ignited a chain reaction, prompting law enforcement investigations, internal audits, and a surge of public outrage. It also sparked difficult questions about oversight, accountability, and the blurred lines between public persona and private conduct. How could someone with so much visibility and access exploit the trust placed in them without immediate detection? How do charities, even high-profile ones, safeguard against the allure of luxury and privilege overshadowing their purpose? This story, gripping as it is only beginning. The consequences of Reid's revelations continue to unfold, affecting not just Meghan Markle's reputation, but the very institutions meant to uplift and support those who have sacrificed the most. By tracing the paths of these diverted funds, understanding the human impact, and exploring the choices that led to this scandal, we uncover a tale that is as much about moral responsibility as it is about financial accountability. The Invictus Games began as a vision that captured the imagination of the world. Prince Harry, himself a veteran, imagined a platform where wounded, injured, and sick service personnel could compete in sporting events designed to celebrate resilience, courage, and determination. The Games were not just a competition. They were a global statement, a message that trauma and disability did not define the limit of one's potential. From the first torch lighting to the opening ceremonies, Every detail was imbued with symbolism and purpose, a stage where soldiers could reclaim their dignity and pride. It didn't take long for the Games to attract high-profile attention. Celebrities, philanthropists, and global media outlets converged to showcase the event. The initiative struck a rare balance of glamour and gravity, merging the seriousness of veteran rehabilitation with the universal appeal of international competition. Among those who stepped into the limelight alongside the Games was Meghan Markle. At first, her involvement appeared natural. Her humanitarian work, media experience, and public persona seemed like a perfect complement to an event seeking both visibility and credibility. Markle's association with the Games began gradually. She attended as a guest, posed for photographs, and engaged with participants. Her public appearances were carefully orchestrated, balancing personal charisma with an air of empathy. The media, ever hungry for royal narratives and celebrity involvement, began highlighting her presence. Articles praised her poise, her compassion, and the way she connected with veterans. But beneath the glimmering surface, Reid began noticing subtle discrepancies in how resources were being allocated. As Invictus expanded, the logistics grew exponentially more complex. With more countries participating, more athletes traveling internationally, and larger audiences attending, the financial demands skyrocketed. There were travel reimbursements, adaptive sports equipment, medical support, lodging, event coordination, marketing, and administrative costs. Every dollar was intended to serve those directly involved: the veterans, their families, and the support teams that enabled them to compete at their best. Reid, who had been integral to managing these operations, observed the meticulous planning required to maintain transparency. Budgets were prepared with granular detail. Invoices were cross-checked. Financial audits were performed regularly. It was within this environment of strict oversight that certain anomalies began to surface. Initially, they were small, reimbursements delayed, equipment purchases questioned, but over time, the patterns grew impossible to ignore. Funds allocated for adaptive sports programs began showing irregular transactions. Payments to suppliers went to unfamiliar accounts. Some invoices bore the signature of Markle's team, while others listed her personal approval or authorization. Reid noticed private flight bookings and luxury hotel accommodations linked to event dates, but they seemed inconsistent with the purpose of the Games. At first, he rationalized these as premium accommodations for dignitaries, but the sheer frequency, scale, and cost raised red flags. Reid recalls a particularly telling moment when he examined a set of receipts for a European leg of the Invictus Games. An invoice for a high-end designer suite at a luxury Parisian hotel was categorized as a team accommodation expense. The cost was staggering, far exceeding the budgets allocated for athletes or support staff. Additionally, luxury transportation services, including private jets, were listed as event-related expenses. Cross-referencing the schedules revealed that many of these trips coincided with social engagements, photo opportunities, or personal leisure activities for Markle rather than official Invictus responsibilities. It was not only the scope of the spending but the audacity that stunned Reid. Charges for jewelry, designer wardrobes, and bespoke fashion items appeared repeatedly in internal financial records. Each entry was carefully disguised under broad expense categories, making it difficult for anyone to immediately spot the diversion. Yet, once patterns emerged, the trail became undeniable. Funds meant to provide opportunities, support rehabilitation, and honor the sacrifices of veterans were being redirected to luxury indulgences, all while the participants themselves faced delayed reimbursements and substandard accommodations. The realization hit Reid with a mixture of disbelief and resolve. Meghan Markle, whose public persona had always emphasized charity, empathy, and global awareness, was implicated in financial activity that contradicted every narrative surrounding her image. Reid began piecing together the human impact of these transactions. Veterans delayed in receiving essential equipment, organizers forced to cut corners, and competitors who had trained for months or years left with logistical challenges, all while extravagant spending continued under the guise of legitimate event operations. Communication between Markle's team and Invictus leadership became a focal point of investigation. Emails revealed instructions on expense approvals, subtle guidance on which charges could be classified as event-related and which might be categorized differently to avoid scrutiny. Internal messages indicated awareness of budget overruns, yet reassurances were given to Reid and other staffers that everything was aligned with objectives. This deliberate obfuscation created an environment where accountability was muddied and fiduciary responsibility was compromised. What made this situation even more complex was Markle's high-profile position. As a figure associated with the royal family, any allegations of financial misconduct would inevitably attract global media attention. Reid understood the stakes. Exposing these discrepancies meant challenging not only a celebrity, but also a network of influence and public perception carefully curated over years. The decision to act was not just about ethics, but about courage, facing the potential backlash, media scrutiny, and legal challenges that were sure to follow. In the months leading to the public revelation, Reid continued gathering evidence. He traced financial flows across multiple accounts, confirmed purchases with independent suppliers, and coordinated with legal advisors to ensure documentation was airtight. Each new discovery reinforced the narrative of diversion. Expensive jewelry ordered under charitable project codes, private jets booked for appearances unrelated to Invictus obligations, and luxury accommodations reimbursed under the pretense of official needs. The scale and frequency of these transactions painted a picture that could no longer be dismissed as error or oversight. Simultaneously, Reid maintained communication with key stakeholders within Invictus. Some staff were hesitant, fearful of jeopardizing their careers or alienating influential figures, while others quietly supported the initiative to bring transparency. Reid's leadership and integrity created a network of allies committed to truth, willing to provide testimony, financial records, and first-hand observations. Together, they fortified the case, ensuring that when the story broke, it would withstand the inevitable attempts at denial, spin, or legal maneuvering. As the first public disclosures approached, Reid prepared for the whirlwind. The narrative had to balance factual precision with human impact. Every veteran affected, every participant delayed or disadvantaged, every stakeholder misled, became part of the story. This was not about personal vendetta. It was about restoring the integrity of the Invictus Games, protecting the reputation of the participants, and holding individuals accountable for actions that undermine the mission of the organization. This chapter establishes the foundation of the scandal, detailing the rise of Invictus, Markle's involvement, and the financial discrepancies that triggered a global investigation. The groundwork is set for exploring deeper layers of the story, the personal motivations, the systemic challenges, and the dramatic consequences that would follow in subsequent chapters. The story of the Invictus Games scandal did not simply hinge on allegations or assumptions. It hinged on numbers, ledgers, and the meticulous tracing of money. Dominic Reid had spent months piecing together what initially seemed like scattered financial anomalies, and what emerged was a pattern so audacious it bordered on disbelief. Each line item on invoices, each transfer of funds, and each expense report began to reveal a narrative that contradicted every carefully curated public image of Meghan Markle as a philanthropist and empathetic supporter of veterans. The first glaring irregularity came in the form of travel expenses. The Invictus Games, while international in scope, had defined protocols for transport. Flights for athletes, coaches, and essential staff were booked economy or business class, depending on the mission, and budgets were allocated years in advance to prevent overrun. Yet, Reid noticed private jets were being booked repeatedly under the guise of official travel. At first glance, the bookings were linked to event coordination meetings, VIP receptions, or media engagements. Upon closer inspection, however, the timing and routes suggested leisure or personal benefit rather than operational necessity. In one instance, a private flight from London to Los Angeles coincided with an appearance at a charity gala unrelated to Invictus programming, carrying a passenger manifest that included staff personal assistants and stylists, but no veterans or operational personnel. Luxury accommodations followed the same troubling pattern. Hotel bookings for athletes and teams were intended to balance comfort with practicality, ensuring participants could rest and prepare for competition without incurring unnecessary costs. However, Reid's investigations revealed multiple instances of high-end suites and penthouses being billed under event expenses. Properties booked under the Invictus ledger included names like the Ritz Paris, the Four Seasons in Beverly Hills, and boutique hotels in Monaco, each costing tens of thousands per night. For veterans, accommodations were often modest yet functional. For Markle's entourage, they were lavish and opulent. Jewelry and designer purchases represented the most brazen form of diversion. Internal invoices indicated charges for high-value items, including bespoke necklaces, diamond earrings, and luxury watches, ostensibly for charitable gifting. Yet, cross-referencing with shipping records, delivery confirmations, and internal communications suggested these purchases were intended for personal use. Several suppliers confirmed that items were requested by a personal assistant or under Markle's name, and not distributed to veterans, staff, or other beneficiaries of the Invictus Games. Each invoice carefully disguised in general event expenses categories, making it difficult to detect without a forensic review. Reid recalls the day he realized the full magnitude of the financial diversion. Sitting in a conference room, he spread hundreds of documents, invoices, and bank statements across the table. It was not just the individual purchases, but the cumulative total that was staggering. Across 2 fiscal years, expenditures classified under event-related costs for luxury travel, designer goods, and private accommodations exceeded several million pounds. Millions that should have supported veterans, funding adaptive equipment, physiotherapy sessions, counseling services, and competition logistics, had been diverted for personal indulgence. One particularly damning discovery involved a multi-city European tour arranged ostensibly for Invictus representatives. The itinerary was ambitious: Paris, Munich, Rome, and Amsterdam, with stops intended to engage sponsors and oversee veteran programs. The expense breakdown, however, included private helicopters between airports, designer shopping excursions, and luxury suites booked for Markle and her entourage. Detailed records indicated these costs were disguised under categories such as event liaison expenses or VIP logistics, exploiting loopholes in the organization's financial reporting. Veterans attending the events, in contrast, experienced delays in reimbursements, cramped accommodations, and logistical challenges that hindered their performance and overall experience. Internal communications provided further context to Reid's discovery. Emails between Markle's aides and Invictus staff outlined strategies for classifying purchases as legitimate event expenses. One internal memo explicitly recommended allocating luxury spending to high-profile engagement budgets to minimize scrutiny. Another email included subtle instructions to ensure receipts and invoices matched approved categories, even if the underlying purpose of the purchase was personal. The language in these communications suggested a conscious effort to mask financial misconduct under the guise of operational necessity. Reid also examined patterns in timing and recurrence. Luxury purchases and extravagant travel consistently coincided with media events, charity galas, or high-profile appearances. Each event provided an opportunity to link personal spending to public visibility, reinforcing a curated narrative of engagement and philanthropy. Yet, the underlying transactions revealed the reality. Money that should have empowered veterans was being siphoned to fund a lifestyle that projected glamour rather than charity. The emotional impact of these findings weighed heavily on Reid. The Invictus Games had been built on the promise of hope, recovery, and celebration for wounded service members. Athletes like James, a young soldier recovering from multiple injuries, relied on timely delivery of adaptive equipment. Others depended on structured training programs funded through the organization's budget. Every diverted pound represented a tangible setback in someone's recovery journey. Reid recalls conversations with staff who expressed frustration, disappointment, and disbelief at how a high-profile figure could exploit a charity dedicated to healing and honor. Reid's next challenge was documenting and corroborating the evidence. He engaged accountants, auditors, and legal advisors to trace the flow of funds across accounts, identify patterns of misclassification, and link personal benefits to official expense reports. Cross-referencing supplier confirmations, shipping records, and bank statements provided an undeniable chain of evidence. Each layer of documentation strengthened the case, and prepared it for eventual disclosure. The narrative of luxury versus responsibility created a stark contrast. The Invictus Games embodied resilience, integrity, and the triumph of human spirit over adversity. Against this backdrop, the allegations of financial misuse painted a shocking image of entitlement, deception, and exploitation. Reid knew that revealing the truth would not only generate global media attention, but also ignite intense public scrutiny of Markle, the Games, and the broader network surrounding high-profile charitable engagements. As this chapter closes, the scene is set for the next stage: the internal confrontation, media exposure, and cascading consequences of these revelations. Reid's painstaking documentation, the undeniable patterns of luxury spending, and the human cost of diverted funds lay the groundwork for the scandal that would ultimately lead to arrests and public outrage. This chapter delves deep into the mechanics of the misconduct, the patterns that betrayed intent, and the emotional and operational consequences of diverting resources from those who depended on them. After weeks of meticulously reviewing the financial records, invoices, emails, and internal communications, Dominic Reid OBE faced a moral and professional crossroad. Every document he examined seemed to tell the same troubling story. Funds intended to support wounded veterans were being redirected to support a lavish lifestyle, under the guise of Invictus Games operations. The gravity of the discovery was immense, and Reid knew that exposing the truth would not be without consequences. Reid spent long nights considering the ethical implications. On one hand, revealing the misuse could damage reputations, invite public scrutiny, and potentially compromise the organization's partnerships and sponsorships. On the other hand, staying silent would betray the very principles that Invictus Games stood for, undermining the trust of veterans who relied on the charity for support, therapy, and a sense of community. Reid's sense of duty prevailed. For him, the choice was clear. Transparency and justice had to outweigh fear of confrontation or backlash. The first step involved preparing an airtight case. Reid knew that to make a public accusation of this magnitude, he needed irrefutable evidence. He coordinated with forensic accountants to trace every penny, mapping the flow of funds from official accounts to personal expenses. Luxury purchases were cataloged, travel itineraries cross-referenced, and personal correspondence reviewed for explicit instructions or indications of intent. The goal was to construct a narrative so precise that it would leave no room for ambiguity or denial. Among the most damning pieces of evidence were credit card statements and invoices disguised as operational expenses. Designer gowns, private jet charters, high-end hotel suites, and expensive jewelry had all been billed to Invictus accounts, with some expenditures stretching into the millions over several fiscal years. These purchases were clearly unrelated to the charity's mission, yet were carefully masked under legitimate-looking entries such as event coordination or VIP hospitality. Reid realized the audacity of these transactions wasn't just in their scale, but in the deliberate effort to conceal them. Reid also documented the human cost. He collected testimonies from staff and volunteers who noticed discrepancies or raised concerns internally, but were either ignored or subtly pressured to remain silent. Several veterans expressed frustration over delays in equipment delivery, therapy reimbursements, and training program funding. One account described a young veteran who had to postpone his rehabilitation program because the adaptive equipment he needed had not been purchased due to budget constraints, even as millions were being spent on personal luxuries. Reid knew that presenting the financial evidence alongside the human stories would amplify the impact and underscore the betrayal. The decision to go public was not made lightly. Reid was aware that Meghan Markle's prominence, public image, and connections could make any allegation appear sensationalized or politically motivated. To safeguard credibility, he enlisted legal advisors and communications experts to prepare a comprehensive disclosure plan. Every document, every email, every financial record had to withstand intense scrutiny, anticipating both media investigations and legal challenges. Once the documentation was complete, Reid scheduled meetings with the Invictus Games Board of Trustees. He presented the findings in meticulous detail, illustrating each instance of misuse with supporting evidence. The reaction ranged from disbelief to shock. Some trustees initially questioned whether errors or misunderstandings could explain the expenditures. Reid countered with clear, traceable evidence showing deliberate classification of personal expenses as organizational costs. He emphasized the recurring nature of the transactions, the patterns aligning with public appearances and media engagements, and the disparity between veterans' needs and luxury spending. The board faced a critical choice: address the issue quietly, potentially containing it internally, or escalate it publicly, risking a media storm and legal scrutiny. Dominic Reid advocated strongly for transparency, arguing that integrity and accountability were paramount. Concealing the truth would undermine the organization's mission and betray the very people Invictus Games was founded to serve. After hours of deliberation, the board unanimously agreed that the findings needed to be made public and the appropriate authorities notified. The first public shockwaves came through controlled disclosures. Reid arranged briefings with senior journalists known for investigative rigor and credibility. Leaks were carefully timed to coincide with internal audits, creating a compelling narrative that could not be dismissed as rumor or conjecture. Headlines soon reflected the scale and audacity of the allegations. Invictus funds allegedly misused for personal luxury by Meghan Markle. Charity scandal rocks royal patronage. Millions meant for veterans allegedly diverted to designer lifestyles. Reid prepared for the inevitable backlash. Social media erupted with speculation, opinion, and outrage. Some users defended Markle, citing her history of public charity work and suggesting the accusations were politically motivated or exaggerated. Others were incensed, expressing disbelief that funds meant for veterans could be diverted so blatantly. Reid remained steadfast, emphasizing the documented evidence and the stories of those affected. He understood that credibility and transparency were his strongest allies in the face of public debate. The revelation triggered immediate action from regulatory and legal bodies. Investigators began reviewing financial records, interviewing staff, and examining the chain of authorization for each disputed expense. Banks were asked to freeze certain accounts, pending forensic review. Markle's public team responded with denials, claiming that all expenditures were either legitimate or approved under operational guidelines. However, Reid's evidence included email threads, explicit instructions, and financial documents that contradicted these statements. Each new disclosure further intensified media scrutiny and public interest. Veterans themselves began to respond. Several shared personal stories publicly, detailing how delays, shortages, or lack of resources impacted their rehabilitation and competition readiness. The human element transformed abstract numbers into tangible consequences, evoking empathy and anger from the public. Reid recognized that these narratives were essential in communicating the broader significance of the misuse, reminding the world that this was not merely a financial scandal, but a betrayal of trust and moral responsibility. As the story unfolded, Reid also faced personal challenges. Threats, attempts at discrediting, and public criticism emerged. High-profile defenders of Markle attempted to paint him as opportunistic or vindictive. Yet, Reid remained focused on facts, evidence, and the welfare of those served by Invictus Games. He continued to provide auditors, regulators, and the press with detailed documentation, ensuring transparency and minimizing the risk of misinformation. The decision to expose the misuse culminated in a public statement, delivered by Reid himself, detailing the extent of the financial irregularities and the impact on veterans. The statement emphasized that the goal was not punishment but accountability, restoration of trust, and protection of those who depended on the charity. The statement resonated widely, drawing global attention, triggering legal investigations, and setting in motion events that would ultimately lead to arrests and formal charges. By the end of this chapter, the groundwork was laid for an escalating scandal. The public, regulators, and media now understood the severity of the alleged misconduct, and Meghan Markle's position as a high-profile figure added intensity to every revelation. Reid's meticulous investigation, unwavering commitment to transparency, and the stark contrast between luxury indulgence and veterans' unmet needs created a story that captivated the world, setting the stage for dramatic confrontations, legal proceedings, and intense emotional fallout in the chapters to follow. The morning after the initial disclosures went public, a storm had already begun brewing behind the gilded doors of Meghan Markle's team. The carefully curated image of philanthropic dedication, elegant charity work, and compassionate patronage that had been meticulously constructed over the years was now under siege. The headlines screamed accusations of financial misuse, luxury spending, and betrayal of veterans' trust. For Markle, the first waves of panic hit with a force that she could neither anticipate nor control. Markle was reportedly informed of the leaks by her chief of staff via a hurried phone call. The tone of urgency in the message was unmistakable. Every word seemed to amplify the gravity of the situation. Dominic Reid has gone public. The documents, the invoices, the emails, they're all out there. Media are calling. Investigators are on the way. As she listened, the carefully maintained calm she often displayed in public began to fracture. Her usual composure, the serene poise that had charmed both audiences and the press, gave way to disbelief, then rising panic. The initial reaction was almost instinctual. Calls were made frantically to legal advisors, communications specialists, and loyal aides. "We need control over the narrative," one aide reportedly urged, emphasizing that the situation demanded immediate action to prevent reputational collapse. Legal teams were instructed to review the evidence, prepare formal statements, and draft denials. Communications experts began outlining strategies to frame the expenditures as legitimate, operational, or within standard organizational discretion. But even as plans were formed, the sheer volume of the evidence leaked to the press made containment nearly impossible. Simultaneously, Markle reportedly began scrutinizing her personal finances with increasing anxiety. The invoices and bank statements exposed by Reid revealed a level of detail and traceability that she could not ignore. Every private jet flight, designer gown, luxury hotel booking, and extravagant purchase now existed in a digital trail that linked directly back to her personal benefit, allegedly funded through diverted charity money. The realization that these transactions were meticulously documented and publicly accessible amplified the sense of impending legal jeopardy. Markle's inner circle, previously accustomed to smooth operations and controlled messaging, was in turmoil. Advisors debated the best course of action, weighing immediate denials against strategic silence. Some argued that acknowledging minor missteps could humanize Markle, while others insisted that any admission, no matter how small, could be construed as an admission of guilt. The tension in the room was palpable, as even the most confident aides recognized the extraordinary stakes. The allegations were not only public and quantifiable, but tied to the welfare of veterans who had invested trust and hope in the charity. Behind the scenes, Markle reportedly began organizing defensive measures. Teams were instructed to review every aspect of Invictus Games' finances that could remotely touch her personal involvement. Consultants were brought in to scrutinize accounting methods, reclassify expenses, and create justifications that could withstand public and legal scrutiny. But the more her team dug, the more complicated the picture became. Invoices that had been rationalized as event management costs were clearly tied to personal purchases. Correspondence showed explicit instructions that funds be allocated to luxury travel and wardrobe expenses. Each discovery heightened the urgency of the situation and intensified Markle's stress. As the hours passed, Markle's panic extended beyond financial concerns. Social media, always a powerful tool, became an uncontrollable force. Users from around the globe commented on every leaked detail, dissecting invoices, photos, and reports. Some expressed outrage, others mocked the extravagant spending, and many highlighted the stark contrast between veterans struggling for resources and the alleged luxury expenditures. Markle, accustomed to carefully curated digital narratives, now faced an environment where the story unfolded with its own momentum, independent of her control. Reports suggest that Markle's personal meetings became increasingly tense. Advisors described her as agitated, moving between planning damage control and attempting to contain the emotional fallout. One internal memo reportedly captured her questioning why Dominic Reid, a trusted figure in the charity's leadership, would risk everything to go public. The tone of disbelief, frustration, and fear became a recurring theme in these internal sessions, reflecting not only concern for public perception, but also the very real possibility of legal consequences. By midday, the first external communications had been drafted, yet the public's appetite for information had already intensified. Major news outlets, social media influencers, and veteran advocacy groups were calling for transparency, accountability, and immediate answers. Press conferences, legal filings, and public statements were coordinated with urgency. However, leaks from within Invictus Games meant that even these carefully orchestrated communications faced scrutiny and criticism. Every attempt to frame the narrative as operational necessity or administrative misunderstanding was met with evidence contradicting such claims. The pressure intensified as Dominic Reid continued to provide journalists and investigators with additional documentation. Detailed spreadsheets, email chains, and expense logs were shared with key reporters, demonstrating a persistent pattern of allegedly diverted funds. Reid's methodical and evidence-backed approach left little room for misinterpretation or plausible deniability. For Markle, this meant that the crisis could not be managed through spin or deflection alone. The narrative was now anchored in undeniable documentation. Within hours, Markle's panic reportedly shifted into a strategic phase. Legal counsel advised preparing for possible investigations, subpoenas, and charges. Public relations teams worked to craft messaging that emphasized charitable intent and operational oversight, while attempting to downplay the extent of the luxury expenditures. Markle herself was said to be involved in these discussions, weighing statements, rehearsing responses, and considering potential outcomes in private. The atmosphere was one of controlled chaos, with every decision carrying potential ramifications for reputation, finances, and personal freedom. The impact on Markle's public image was immediate and stark. Headlines reflected the unfolding scandal, often juxtaposing the allegations with previous charitable endeavors. Media outlets framed the story as a shocking betrayal, with public trust hanging in the balance. Opinion pieces speculated about motives, while investigative journalists examined patterns of spending, timelines, and direct correlations with high-profile events. Markle's carefully cultivated persona, once centered on philanthropy, empowerment, and elegance, now faced unprecedented public scrutiny. As the day progressed, insiders reported that Markle's emotional state fluctuated dramatically. Fear, frustration, and anger alternated with moments of defiance and strategic planning. The weight of the evidence, combined with the rapid spread of information, created a relentless cycle of crisis management, internal debate, and personal anxiety. Advisors described her as intensely focused, yet visibly strained, grappling with both the immediate fallout and the long-term consequences of exposure. By evening, the reality of potential legal consequences became unavoidable. Investigators were reviewing records, media coverage was relentless, and the public discourse was dominated by the allegations. Markle reportedly recognized that the situation had escalated beyond any capacity for private containment. For the first time, the implications of Dominic Reid's disclosures began to crystallize. The allegations of financial misuse were not merely a reputational threat, but a potential legal challenge with serious consequences. As night fell, Markle's team convened one final strategy session for the day. Plans for immediate responses, long-term messaging, and legal positioning were discussed at length. Every detail was scrutinized, every statement rehearsed, and every possible scenario considered. The sense of urgency remained, knowing that the next day would bring further scrutiny, additional evidence disclosures, and heightened public attention. The storm was only beginning, and the challenge of navigating the allegations would dominate the days and weeks ahead. In conclusion, this chapter illustrates the first true cracks in Meghan Markle's controlled public image, revealing a behind-the-scenes struggle marked by panic, strategic calculation, and the dawning realization of potential legal exposure. Dominic Reid's disclosures had triggered a series of events that could not be reversed, setting in motion internal chaos, public outrage, and a chain reaction that would escalate in the chapters to come. The foundations of a scandal were firmly established, leaving Markle to navigate an unprecedented crisis where every action, statement, and decision would be scrutinized by a global audience. The morning after Meghan Markle's internal panic sessions, the story had already erupted into a global media frenzy. As the sun rose over London, New York, Los Angeles, and Sydney, News outlets scrambled to cover the latest allegations involving the Duchess and the Invictus Games. What had begun as an internal leak orchestrated by Dominic Reid quickly escalated into a full-blown international scandal. Headlines screamed accusations of financial misconduct, lavish personal spending at the expense of veterans, and questions about integrity that would reverberate through the royal and philanthropic spheres for weeks to come. The first wave of coverage set the tone. Major newspapers published breaking stories with evidence-laden summaries, including screenshots of invoices, spreadsheets, and email correspondence provided by Reid. Television networks interrupted regular programming to discuss the unfolding crisis, while online platforms flooded feeds with hashtags such as hashtag Meghan Scandal, hashtag Invictus Funds, and hashtag Charity Controversy. Every post, every video clip, and every analysis magnified the story, reaching millions of viewers within hours. The velocity of information ensured that no single narrative could dominate, but the accumulation of evidence presented a damning picture that could not be ignored. Public reaction was instantaneous and multifaceted. Social media platforms became arenas of debate, outrage, and speculation. Veteran advocacy groups, who had once lauded Markle for her involvement, now expressed disappointment, anger, and disbelief. Comments ranged from expressions of personal betrayal to demands for legal accountability. Users shared comparisons of charity promises versus alleged luxury expenditures, juxtaposing the suffering of veterans with the extravagant lifestyle allegedly financed by diverted funds. The emotional intensity of these reactions amplified the stakes for Markle, signaling that public opinion had shifted decisively against her. News analysts and commentators began dissecting every angle. On morning talk shows and news panels, experts weighed in on the implications of the leaked financial records. Accountants described the improbability of the transactions being accidental, while legal experts speculated on the potential criminal consequences. Discussions included the legality of fund diversion, breach of fiduciary duty, and the ethical implications for someone occupying such a public and trusted role. This analytical coverage, paired with emotional reactions from audiences, created a sense of both inevitability and urgency. The narrative was now larger than any individual statement or PR maneuver. International media quickly picked up the story, ensuring that the scandal transcended borders. In Europe, news outlets contrasted Markle's alleged misuse of funds with charitable traditions of transparency and accountability, framing the scandal as a breach of ethical norms expected from high-profile public figures. In the United States, coverage emphasized Markle's American roots and questioned how such behavior might reflect on public perceptions of trust, leadership, and celebrity philanthropy. Even in Asia and Australia, media reported extensively, often highlighting the emotional impact on veterans and the international implications for charity governance. The sheer intensity of coverage created a feedback loop that amplified public scrutiny. Every new revelation prompted further reporting, and every tweet or post became a source of potential investigation. Investigative journalists analyzed documents line by line, tracing payments, flight itineraries, and luxury purchases, confirming that the alleged diversion of funds was both systematic and extensive. This meticulous reporting lent credibility to Dominic Reid's claims and made it increasingly difficult for Markle's team to contain or refute the story effectively. Veteran groups and charity watchdogs became vocal participants in the public discourse. Organizations that had previously supported the Invictus Games began questioning internal processes and governance. Statements called for independent audits, thorough investigations, and accountability for any misuse of funds. These voices added moral weight to the controversy, emphasizing that the implications were not merely reputational, but touched on the very real welfare of veterans who relied on the charity for support, rehabilitation, and recognition. Social media influencers and commentators amplified the emotional resonance of the scandal. Video clips showing veterans reacting to the news, detailed analyses of invoices, and discussions about Markle's previous public statements were shared and reshared. The narrative became increasingly visual, as photos of luxury goods allegedly purchased with charity funds were juxtaposed against images of struggling veterans and underfunded programs. This stark contrast reinforced the perception of misuse and deepened the sense of betrayal among viewers. Meanwhile, traditional media outlets continued to provide comprehensive coverage. Newspapers featured editorials weighing ethical obligations, television news programs conducted interviews with financial experts, and online platforms hosted live discussions with veterans, charity auditors, and legal analysts. Each segment reinforced the story's emotional and factual dimensions, combining compelling human interest angles with concrete evidence. For Markle, this multi-pronged media exposure meant that no detail could remain private, and every aspect of her financial involvement was under intense examination. The speed and breadth of the media coverage forced immediate responses from Meghan Markle's team. Press releases were issued, statements were crafted, and social media posts attempted to contextualize the allegations. Legal teams prepared for possible investigations and potential charges, knowing that public perception could influence the trajectory of any proceedings. However, the intensity of the media frenzy, combined with the relentless dissemination of evidence, limited the effectiveness of damage control strategies. Each attempted clarification or denial was met with skepticism, often prompting further scrutiny instead of mitigation. Public sentiment continued to polarize. Supporters of Markle attempted to highlight her previous philanthropic work, arguing that her intentions were charitable, while critics focused on the alleged evidence of luxury spending. The emotional stakes were high, as viewers wrestled with conflicting narratives, the Duchess as a committed philanthropist versus the individual allegedly exploiting charitable resources for personal gain. This tension contributed to a dynamic, evolving discourse that extended beyond simple media reporting into moral, ethical, and social dimensions. The international scope of the coverage created additional challenges. Diplomats, international charity regulators, and global philanthropists closely monitored the developments, considering potential implications for collaborative projects, endorsements, and cross-border funding initiatives. The story's reach demonstrated that the alleged financial misuse was not just a localized scandal, but a matter of global concern, reflecting on charity governance standards, leadership integrity, and the responsibilities of high-profile figures in positions of trust. By the end of the first 24 hours, the magnitude of the public outcry was unmistakable. Media saturation, social media amplification, and veteran advocacy had transformed a leaked internal disclosure into an international phenomenon. The implications for Meghan Markle were profound. Every decision, every public appearance, and every statement was now subject to intense scrutiny, and the consequences, both reputational and legal, loomed larger with each passing hour. This chapter demonstrates how quickly allegations, when substantiated with evidence and amplified by global media, can become a storm that engulfs public figures. Meghan Markle's predicament illustrates the interplay between leaked information, media coverage, and public reaction, showing that the perception of accountability can escalate almost as quickly as the factual narrative itself. The combination of meticulously documented evidence, global dissemination, and emotionally charged public responses ensured that the story would dominate discourse, setting the stage for further developments in the legal, personal, and charitable spheres. Dominic Reid OBE had always been known as a meticulous organizer, a figure of authority in the Invictus Games community, respected for his unwavering commitment to supporting veterans. But on the day he stepped into the glare of global attention, Reid transformed from a background administrator into the central figure in an explosive revelation that would rock both royal circles and charitable organizations worldwide. Sitting down for a press briefing that was broadcast live across multiple platforms, Reid's demeanor was calm yet authoritative, each word measured, each document presented with precision, leaving no room for ambiguity. Reid began by framing the stakes. The Invictus Games was not merely an international sporting event. It was a lifeline for veterans, a platform for rehabilitation, community building, and recognition of sacrifices made. He emphasized the trust donors placed in the organization and the moral obligation of leadership to safeguard every pound, dollar, and euro contributed. The contrast he drew between the noble mission of the charity and the alleged actions that had diverted funds to personal luxuries created immediate tension, framing the scandal not just as financial impropriety, but as a betrayal of core values. He presented the first set of evidence with undeniable clarity. Invoices for private jet flights, Invoices for exclusive jewelry boutiques, luxury designer wardrobes, and lavish hotel stays were meticulously itemized. Each entry detailed dates, amounts, and the specific nature of the expenditures, which Reid explained were traced directly to accounts managed by Meghan Markle in her capacity as a figurehead and public ambassador of the Games. The meticulousness of his presentation left little room for misinterpretation. It wasn't a matter of miscommunication or administrative error. It was a systematic diversion of funds intended for charitable purposes. Dominic Reid emphasized the timeline of the alleged misconduct.